Swept away into the open sea by a violent night tide, a lone surfer finds himself drifting farther and farther from the shore he once trusted. What begins as a peaceful evening ride becomes a catastrophic fight for survival when the current pulls him past the break and into pitch-black waters. With no rescue in sight, no food and no fresh water, he is left with nothing but his damaged board, a piece of floating debris, and the will to endure the impossible. Over the next 72 hours, he will battle dehydration, cold, exhaustion, and the crushing vastness of the ocean. And his only lifeline will come from the thin film of condensation he manages to collect from the night air. This is a story of struggle, resilience, and the brutal reality of being lost at sea alone. Before continuing this story, the narrator invites viewers to share from which country and city they are watching. He also encourages them to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so they don't miss what this man had to endure during his 72-hour fight for survival in the open sea. The moment the current tore him away from the coastline, everything familiar disappeared behind him. In the darkness, the rhythm of the waves changed, no longer playful, no longer predictable. The ocean took on a new personality, one that seemed alive, aware of him, and entirely indifferent to whether he lived or died. The surfer clung to his board as the wind sliced across the surface of the water, carrying the smell of salt and the distant groan of waves collapsing somewhere far beyond his reach. His breathing was sharp and uneven as he fought the instinctive panic rising inside him, a panic born from the realization that he no longer had control. The sea had taken that from him. His only choice was to stay afloat long enough to see daylight again, even if daylight brought no rescue, no land, and no guarantee of survival. When dawn finally broke, it did little to comfort him. The sky was a faded sheet of gray, offering no warmth and no promise of direction. The swells lifted him and dropped him with heavy, rhythmic force, each movement draining the little energy he had left. Hunger gnawed at him early, but thirst arrived faster and far more viciously. His lips cracked within hours and his tongue grew thick and dry. Instinctively, he cupped his hands to collect sea spray, only to remind himself that salt water would kill him faster. That was when he noticed something. A faint layer of moisture clinging to a smooth sheet of debris drifting beside him. It wasn't much, far from enough, but it was water he could drink. Condensation, a tiny miracle in the middle of nowhere. He wiped the droplets off the surface and pressed them to his lips, letting the cold trickle soothe the burning in his throat. It wasn't enough to revive him, but it was enough to keep him going. As the hours stretched into a second day, hallucinations tugged gently at the edges of his mind. Shapes formed in the distance, mirages disguised as boats, islands, or floating objects that dissolved the moment he blinked. The sun beat down on him relentlessly, turning the water around him into a shimmering trap of heat and reflection. He shielded his eyes with his forearm, fighting to stay present, fighting to stay conscious. Every sound began to feel amplified. The slap of waves against the board, the hiss of wind across the surface, the hollow thud of debris tapping against his leg. These became the rhythms of his reality, rhythms he clung to so he wouldn't drift away into panic or despair. At night, the cold crept back in, shaking him so violently he feared he might lose his grip entirely. Yet each new sunrise brought with it another thin coat of condensation on the debris, and every tiny droplet he collected was a reminder that he was not done. He still had hours left to fight. The night had started like any other for him. Calm wind, steady waves, and the familiar comfort of being on his board just beyond the shoreline. He had surfed that stretch of coast countless times, never once imagining that a sudden shift in the current could turn a simple outing into a life-threatening disaster. But that is exactly what happened. Without warning, a powerful tide surged beneath him, dragging both him and his board into deeper water. He tried to paddle back, but the pull was stronger than anything he had ever felt. Within minutes, the beach lights had vanished behind him, swallowed by the dark horizon. By the time he realized he was too far to return, he was already drifting into open sea. The further he drifted, the clearer it became that no one on shore would hear him. The wind carried his voice away, and the waves drowned out any sound he tried to make. His board, cracked from the violent surge, barely kept him afloat. With each passing hour, the coastline disappeared completely, leaving him surrounded by nothing but black water and cold night air. The shock of what had happened settled in slowly. He was alone, unprepared, and being carried farther away by currents he couldn't fight. When morning came, it offered no relief. The sun exposed how far he had traveled. No boats, no aircraft, no signs of land in any direction. The dehydration hit him early, far earlier than he expected. His lips dried, his throat burned, and he knew drinking seawater would only worsen his condition. That was when he spotted a piece of plastic debris drifting near him, scratched and sun-worn, but smooth enough to hold droplets. During the night, a thin layer of condensation had gathered on its surface. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign that he had a chance. He held on to that plastic like a lifeline. Every night brought new droplets, barely enough to wet his tongue, yet enough to keep him from collapsing. The waves punished him constantly, lifting and dropping him with no rhythm he could trust. His arms ached from gripping the damaged board, and the salt water stung every cut on his skin. Even so, he refused to let go. He knew that staying afloat and gathering even the smallest droplets could be the difference between making it through the next hour, or not making it at all. As the hours stretched toward the second and third day, exhaustion became his biggest enemy. His vision blurred, his muscles trembled, and the cold night winds cut through him without mercy. Several times he thought he heard boats or voices, only to realize it was his mind trying to fill the silence. Still he kept gathering condensation, swallowing every drop as if it were the last he would ever find. And as long as those droplets formed, he forced himself to believe he still had a chance to survive the endless blue around him. The first signs that something was wrong appeared so subtly that he dismissed them at first. The waves, which moments earlier had been predictable and rhythmic, began shifting beneath him with a strange energy. They lifted his board higher than usual and pulled him down faster than he expected. At the same time, the current seemed to grow heavier, tugging at his legs like an unseen force tightening around him. He looked back toward the shoreline, expecting to see the familiar glow of the beach lights. And for a moment, they were still there, but the distance between him and those lights was widening with every second. Instinctively, he dropped into a paddling position and began fighting against the pull. His arms sliced through the water again and again, but each stroke felt weaker than the one before. The tide was moving faster than he could physically counter. It was like trying to push against a moving wall. His heartbeat quickened as he realized he wasn't just drifting, he was being dragged. The roar of the water seemed to grow louder, and a knot tightened in his chest. He knew this wasn't normal. He had surfed for years, experienced strong current shifts before, but nothing like this. A sudden swell rose beneath him, tilting his board sharply to the right. He leaned to stabilize himself, but the wave rolled so violently that his board cracked against its own movement. The sound of fiberglass splitting echoed through the night. He gripped the sides of the board as the tide pulled him through the breaking point where the waves changed direction, straight into deeper water. Within minutes he was past the line where the ocean floor dropped sharply. The familiar texture of the waves vanished, replaced by deeper, colder surges that had no mercy or pattern. He called out, shouting for anyone on shore who might still hear him, but the wind swallowed his voice before it traveled a few meters. He tried again, louder, pushing past the burning in his throat, but it didn't matter. The vastness of the sea took his words and dissolved them without effort. A heavy realization settled on him. He was alone, and no one knew he was drifting away. His surfboard, now fractured along one side, no longer felt like a tool, but a fragile piece of hope. He clung to it anyway because it was the only thing he had left that floated. The darkness thickened around him as the last hints of the shoreline faded. The night sky seemed to merge with the ocean, leaving him suspended in a world of black water and cold wind. He scanned the horizon for any sign of movement, Boats, lights, anything, but all he saw were ripples catching faint moonlight. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the rush of water beneath him. Each wave that hit his legs felt colder than the one before. He inhaled deeply, trying to steady himself, but even his breath shook. The tide continued pulling him, as if it had chosen a direction of its own. He tried to angle his board sideways to slow the drift, but the force was too strong. His muscles burned from the effort, and his shoulders trembled with exhaustion. He was suddenly aware of how powerless he was against the ocean's strength. Every training, every past experience, every hour he had spent surfing felt useless now. He had never imagined a scenario where his survival could depend on nothing but his grip and the thin shell of fiberglass beneath his chest. Minutes stretched into hours. The waves tossed him like a piece of debris, spinning him at times and lifting him at others. His sense of direction began to fade. He couldn't tell where the shore was anymore, nor which way the tide was carrying him. The only thing he knew was that he had to stay awake. The cold water tried to numb his limbs, and the monotony of the black horizon tried to lull his mind into a dangerous fog. He slapped his own face to stay alert, forcing his eyes open whenever they tried to close. Sometime after midnight, he spotted something drifting ahead of him. At first, he thought it was seaweed or a small buoy, but as he drew closer, it became clearer. It was a flat piece of weathered plastic, possibly from an old fishing crate or storage sheet. He reached out for it, barely managing to hook it with 2 fingers before it floated away. The plastic was smooth on one side and slightly curved, the kind of surface that collected droplets during cold nights. He didn't know it yet, but this would become the most important object he found. As the night grew colder, tiny beads of moisture began forming along its surface. He noticed them by accident when a faint shimmer reflected the moonlight. He lifted the plastic closer and saw the droplets glistening, a mixture of condensation and ocean mist, but still drinkable enough to give him hope. He pressed the edge to his lips, letting the droplets slide into his mouth. They were cold, almost tasteless, but they soothed the dryness in his throat. It wasn't enough to hydrate him properly, but it was enough to remind him that he wasn't done fighting. By the time the first signs of dawn appeared, his arms were numb and his legs trembled every time a wave pushed against them. But he was still alive, exhausted, shaking, dehydrated, but alive. And as long as he could gather even the smallest droplets from that piece of plastic, he had a way to push through another hour. The sun began to rise, revealing the endless blue around him. No land, no boats, no rescue. Just him, his damaged board, the piece of plastic, and a fight he couldn't afford to lose. As dawn pressed against the horizon, Lucas felt the first real sting of what survival at sea truly meant. The night had been chaotic, full of cold wind and unpredictable currents. But the morning delivered a different kind of punishment. Silence. No crashing waves, no distant engines, no voices. Just an endless flat sheet of water stretching into forever. He scanned the surroundings again and again, hoping for a boat, a buoy, any interruption in that vast emptiness. Nothing. The calmness of the ocean mocked him, as if pretending it hadn't just swallowed him whole. His first instinct was to call for help, but he knew it was pointless. His voice was small, breaking, and the sea didn't care. His surfboard, now his only anchor to life, wobbled beneath him as he adjusted his weight. The salt had dried into a crust on his skin, tightening around his face and chest. Lucas took small breaths, trying to pace himself, trying to ignore the panic that pressed at the edges of his mind. He was alone. Yes, but he was not finished. He checked his rash guard pocket again, even though he already knew what was inside. Nothing but a folded piece of wax paper he had forgotten to throw away earlier that day. No water, no food, no emergency whistle. And this wasn't a crowded beach where lifeguards scanned the shoreline. He had drifted far beyond that world. If he didn't accept that soon, the ocean would do it for him. He let his hand trail briefly across the water, feeling how warm it had become. It wasn't comforting. It meant dehydration would come fast. Lucas forced himself to stop thinking about time. Time was an enemy here. If he focused on hours, he would begin to drown in dread. Instead, he analyzed the waves, the wind direction, the patterns in the swells. He remembered advice he had overheard from older fishermen. The ocean talks first. Your job is to listen. So he listened. The wind pushed consistently from the southeast, giving him at least a clue about where he might drift over the next few hours. He had no idea how far from shore he already was, but he clung to any scrap of information like it was gold. He tried turning the board toward where he believed the coast should be, but paddling was nearly impossible. The ocean pushed back with a slow, stubborn force. Every stroke felt like a negotiation with a giant that didn't care if he lived or died. His shoulders started burning almost immediately, but he refused to stop. Even if progress was minimal, movement meant hope. Stagnation meant surrender. And Lucas wasn't surrendering. Not now, not ever. By late morning, the sun was brutal. It hammered down on him with an intensity that drained strength, focus, and hydration all at once. Lucas shielded his eyes with one trembling hand, but it did little to help. His mouth was painfully dry, and each breath tasted like iron. He knew dehydration would become the first great enemy. The second would be exposure. The third, exhaustion. He needed to manage each one if he planned to survive the promised 72 hours that lay ahead. The waves began to lift and fall with more rhythm as the day progressed, and for a moment, Lucas felt a strange comfort in the motion. It reminded him of the early mornings when he would paddle out before sunrise, waiting for the first wave of the day to catch. But this was different. This wasn't the ocean he grew up respecting. This was the ocean showing its teeth. The swells were gentle enough now, but he knew how quickly they could turn violent. The open sea rarely remained patient for long. A shadow suddenly swept beneath him. Lucas froze. His breath caught in his throat as the shape moved with deliberate, heavy grace. For a moment he thought it was a shark, but when the creature surfaced he realized it was a massive sea turtle gliding by. Relief washed through him like cool water. The turtle didn't look at him or acknowledge his presence. It simply passed, unfazed, disappearing into deeper blue. But its appearance was a reminder of something important. He wasn't alone. The ocean was alive, full of creatures who survived every day. If they could, maybe he could too. As the sun began its slow descent, Lucas found a loose strap from the leash attached to the board and tied it around his wrist. He wanted to make sure that if he ever slipped or fainted from heat, he wouldn't drift away from his only lifeline. He repeated this small ritual several times, pulling the strap, checking the knot, confirming that it would hold. It was a small act of control, one of the few he still possessed. And though it didn't solve his greater problems, it prevented panic from taking over. Night approached again, and Lucas prepared himself. The darkness meant colder water, unpredictable currents, and the haunting feeling of being swallowed by a world with no edges. But he had survived one night already. He steadied his breathing, braced himself against the chilling wind, and whispered a silent promise into the darkening horizon. He would fight through this second night with everything he had left. He wasn't ready to vanish into the ocean. Not yet. Not while the story was still being written. The second night hit Lucas harder than the first. The cold felt sharper, the wind more punishing, and the isolation heavier. Fatigue had already seeped deep into his muscles, slowing his movements and dulling his reactions. The ocean's surface darkened to near black, swallowing the horizon, and every splash or distant echo set his nerves on edge. He tightened his grip on the board, reminding himself again that this simple piece of fiberglass was the only barrier between him and the abyss below. Hunger began carving a hollow ache in his stomach, but it was the thirst that truly tormented him. Every swallow felt like dragging sandpaper across dry skin. Lucas kept licking his lips out of instinct, only to taste more salt. He knew he couldn't drink the seawater. He had seen enough survival documentaries to understand how deadly the mistake could be. But desperation whispered temptations all night long. He forced himself to stay alert, shaking off each dangerous impulse. Strangely, the night currents felt more organized than the day's wind. The board drifted steadily north, though Lucas couldn't be sure if that direction was truly helping him. He scanned the darkness for any hint of land, lights, or silhouettes. Nothing. Still, he clung to one simple truth. Drifting meant movement, and movement meant the possibility, no matter how small, of crossing a shipping lane or getting closer to a fishing route. Hours passed, and exhaustion finally broke through his determination. His eyelids grew heavy, threatening to pull him into sleep. But sleep was dangerous. Too dangerous. One slip, one uncontrolled movement, and he could slide off the board without waking. To fight it, Lucas dipped his hands repeatedly into the cold water, shocking himself awake. The chill cut through the fog in his mind, but only for a short moment each time. The cycle repeated again and again, drifting into sleep, shocking himself awake, drifting again. Near midnight, he felt something unexpected. Droplets on his face. At first he feared rain, worried a storm was forming, but the sky was perfectly clear. Then he realized it was condensation forming on the board's surface, collecting into tiny shimmering beads. Lucas watched as the droplets rolled together, growing just enough to gather into a thin thread of fresh water. His breath shook. It wasn't much, not even close to a sip, but it was real, and it was drinkable. He pressed his fingertips gently against the droplets, guiding them toward the edge of the board where they could pool. Every drop mattered. Every fraction of a teaspoon felt sacred. When enough had gathered to wet his lips, he leaned in and absorbed the moisture. It didn't quench his thirst, not even remotely, but it soothed his mind. It proved that the environment wasn't entirely against him. There were still ways to survive if he paid attention. The small victory renewed his focus. Lucas began experimenting, noticing where condensation formed faster and how the board's angles affected the droplets. He shifted his position carefully, trying not to lose balance, and created a small curve in his rash guard that allowed more droplets to funnel into a tiny makeshift pocket. It was primitive, almost laughable, but it worked. And working methods meant survival. Around 3 a.m., the ocean grew restless again. Swells rose unpredictably, lifting the board high before dropping it into deep troughs. Lucas held on tight, bracing his legs against the movement. Every strong wave carried the risk of knocking him loose. He lowered his center of gravity, pressed his chest closer to the board, and rode each swell like he had done countless times before. But this time, the stakes were life and death, not athletic pride. At the peak of one rising swell, Lucas spotted something glowing faintly in the water. It shimmered with each wave, leaving streaks of neon blue under the board. Bioluminescent plankton. Under normal circumstances, he would have admired the beauty. But here, it also served as a quiet reminder. Even the depths held life, motion, and guidance. The glowing trails shifted in patterns that suggested a stronger current moving west. Lucas didn't know if that direction meant safety, but he adjusted his posture subtly, letting the current carry him. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Lucas was trembling with cold, hunger, and exhaustion, but he was alive. He had survived another night, held together by sheer determination and small, precious drops of water collected from the faintest breath of the ocean. The light of morning revealed his cracked skin, numbed limbs, and weakening muscles, but it also revealed something else inside him. A growing fire. He wasn't drifting toward death. He was fighting toward life. The sunrise brought a brief wave of warmth that Lucas desperately needed. His entire body felt stiff, as if every muscle had been replaced with rope pulled too tight. He could barely move his fingers at first, but after rubbing his hands together and stretching slowly, he regained enough control to hold the board securely. The daylight made everything clearer. The water, the sky, and unfortunately, his worsening condition. His lips were cracked. His skin burned from both sun and salt, and his legs trembled each time he adjusted his position. As the morning progressed, the currents carried him farther into a wide, empty expanse of blue. Lucas scanned the horizon continuously, hoping to spot a ship, a buoy, or even drifting debris that could help him. But the ocean around him remained endless and silent. The silence was unnerving. No birds circling overhead, no distant engines, no clouds hinting at rain that could provide him fresh water. Just open water stretching infinitely in every direction. Thirst was now the greatest threat. The tiny droplets he collected during the night had helped him hold on. But daylight offered nothing. Without condensation forming and without rain, Lucas felt the dryness spreading through his throat like a slow burn. He tried not to think about it. He forced himself to breathe through his nose and conserve moisture. The temptation to dip his head into the seawater became almost unbearable. But he knew better. He had seen what salt poisoning could do. Even experienced surfers weren't immune. The sun climbed higher, heating the air and intensifying Lucas's dehydration. Sweat evaporated almost instantly, giving him no chance to reclaim even a drop of moisture. He shielded his face with his forearm as best as he could, but the light reflecting off the water still burned his eyes and blurred his vision. In moments like this, he wished he had anything. Sunglasses, a hat, even a small piece of cloth he could use to block the sun. But he had nothing except his determination. By midday, fatigue pushed him to the edge. His arms felt like they were made of sand and bone, fragile, crumbling, almost useless. His legs were numb from hours of clinging to the board. Every movement took effort. Every breath felt shallow. And yet, even at his weakest, Lucas kept scanning the water. He refused to shut his eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. Sleep meant slipping. Slipping meant drowning. Then, around early afternoon, the ocean changed. Small ripples began forming around him, different from the usual surface movement. Moments later, he saw the cause, a large, slow-moving shadow beneath him. His heart jumped. At first, fear kicked in. A predator, a shark. But the shadow moved gracefully, without sudden turns or sharp movements. When it surfaced just enough for him to glimpse its shape, he realized it was a dolphin. The animal circled him gently, its dorsal fin rising above the water before dipping silently again. Lucas stared in disbelief. The sight of life, friendly life, filled him with a sudden burst of energy. The dolphin's presence didn't mean rescue, but it meant hope. Dolphins often traveled in groups and navigated near productive waters. Where there were dolphins, sometimes there were fish, birds, or even boats not too far away. The dolphin lingered near him for several minutes, occasionally resurfacing to breathe. Each time, it released a soft puff of air that broke the oppressive silence around Lucas. For the first time in many hours, he felt less alone. He spoke to it softly, knowing it couldn't understand, but relieved to hear his own voice. The dolphin eventually drifted away, disappearing deeper into the ocean. But the emotional impact remained. Lucas straightened his posture and re-centered his focus. He wasn't giving up. As the afternoon turned into early evening, a new challenge emerged. Clouds gathering in the distance. Dark, heavy, slow-moving. Lucas squinted, trying to determine if they signaled a storm or just temporary shade. If it rained, he could get fresh water. A blessing. But storms were unpredictable. A large swell or harsh winds could easily knock him into the water or sweep his board away. He had no way to control the outcome. All he could do was prepare. When the first wind gust reached him, it brought a mix of relief and worry. The air cooled, giving him a break from the brutal sun, but the waves began to rise again. Lucas tightened his grip and lowered himself carefully, ready for whatever the weather would bring. Whether it meant water or danger, or both, he knew one thing: he would face it. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. As the evening approached, the wind grew stronger, carrying a sharp bite that replaced the heat of the day. Lucas braced himself as the first large swells lifted and dropped the board beneath him. The storm he had spotted earlier was finally reaching his location. For a moment, He feared it would be violent, something that could easily separate him from the board. But the sky wasn't flashing with lightning, and the thunder remained distant. It wasn't a destructive storm. It was a heavy, relentless rain system moving across the ocean. When the first drops hit his skin, Lucas felt a rush stronger than anything he'd felt since the ordeal began. Rain meant life. Rain meant water. He tilted his head back, opening his mouth to catch as many drops as he could. Fresh water poured down in uneven spurts as the clouds thickened and the sky darkened. He cupped his hands, letting them fill before bringing them quickly to his lips. Each swallow brought an almost overwhelming sense of relief. The burning in his throat eased for the first time in days. Driven by instinct, Lucas used the curved section of his rash guard, the same makeshift system he had used with condensation, to funnel more rain into a small pool on the board's surface. Every method he improvised became more efficient as the rain intensified. For several minutes he drank steadily, replenishing what dehydration had drained from him. The sensation brought tears to his eyes, though he wasn't sure if it was emotion or salt still irritating his vision. But the rain didn't come alone. As the downpour strengthened, so did the waves. The board rocked violently, forcing Lucas to shift his weight constantly to avoid being thrown off. Several times the board nearly slipped out from under him, but he clung to it with enough force to strain his muscles. The storm wasn't trying to save him, it was testing him. Every sip of fresh water came with the risk of losing the only thing keeping him afloat. Night fell quickly, swallowed by thick layers of clouds. The darkness became absolute. Lucas could barely see the board beneath him, navigating only by feel and instinct. The ocean roared around him, each crash echoing through the emptiness. He kept one arm wrapped tightly around the board, using the other to keep his balance as best as he could. The storm pushed him in unpredictable directions, spinning him slowly, then sending him drifting at angles he couldn't track. At one point, a massive wave lifted him several meters above the surface. For a brief second he felt weightless, suspended between rising water and gravity. When the wave collapsed beneath him, Lucas plunged back down, slamming into the board hard enough that he nearly blacked out. Pain shot across his ribs, and for a moment he thought something had cracked. But he forced himself to hold on, refusing to release his grip even as his body screamed for rest. The storm continued for hours. Lucas lost all sense of time, focusing only on staying attached to the board. His fingers cramped and locked around its edges, but he didn't let go. His legs drifted numb beneath him, barely responding to his attempts to adjust position. He fought dizziness, fought nausea, fought panic, anything that could weaken his control over his movements. Even with increased strength from the rainwater he'd consumed, the battle pushed him to his limit. Then, sometime deep into the night, the storm began to ease. The rain slowed, the wind softened, and the ocean gradually settled into gentler swells. Lucas lifted his head, completely drained. He felt beaten, battered, and stretched thin by the relentless chaos. But he also felt lighter. The dehydration that had been suffocating him for 2 days no longer consumed his thoughts. He could think clearly again. He could breathe without burning pain, and he could hold on. As the clouds broke apart, dim moonlight washed over the ocean, revealing something he hadn't seen in nearly 3 days, a silhouette on the horizon. Lucas squinted, unsure if it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the shape remained. A tall, angular shadow, a structure, a man-made object, a boat. His pulse surged. He tried to shout, but his voice cracked, barely carrying across the waves. He slapped the water with his free hand, creating splashes, signaling any way he could. For several agonizing minutes, the boat didn't move. Lucas feared the crew hadn't seen him. Then a small beam of light appeared, sweeping across the water. It passed once, twice, then paused, right on him. The beam locked onto his position, holding steady. Lucas let out a fragile, breathless sob. The boat adjusted course and began moving toward him, cutting through the waves with deliberate speed. After 72 hours of isolation, exhaustion, and near despair, help was finally coming. He had fought to survive, and he had won. When the rescue boat finally reached Lucas, the crew pulled him aboard with a level of urgency that showed just how fragile his condition had become. His limbs barely responded, his skin was cold, and his voice was little more than a whisper. Yet his eyes were awake, focused, and filled with relief that words could never match. The crew wrapped him in blankets, offered him small, careful sips of water, and kept checking his pulse as the boat powered back toward the coast. Lucas lay there silently, gripping the edges of the blanket the same way he had clung to the surfboard. Steady, grounded, unwilling to let go. He listened to the engine rumbling beneath him, the first sound in 3 days that didn't threaten his life. For the first time since he was dragged into open sea, he felt safe. During the hours that followed, as the boat cut through calmer waters, Lucas slowly began recounting what had happened. The crew listened in disbelief as he described the night tide ripping him away from the shore, the 2 full days drifting without food, the condensation he had collected for survival, and the storm that nearly took everything from him. Each detail painted a clearer picture of the battle he had endured. A quiet, relentless fight against the ocean, dehydration, exhaustion, and fear. The men aboard knew the sea well enough to understand how small the margin between life and death truly is out there. And yet Lucas had held on. He hadn't surrendered, not even when everything around him urged him to. His survival wasn't the result of luck alone. It was determination, instinct, and an unbreakable will to live. By the time they reached the harbor, dawn was breaking again, casting warm colors across the sky. The same sky Lucas had prayed under, fought under, and survived under for 72 uninterrupted hours. Paramedics waited on the dock, ready to take him in. But Lucas paused for a moment before stepping off the boat. He stood there, weak but steady, taking a final look at the open sea that had nearly claimed his life. It was vast, unforgiving, and unpredictable, yet he felt no hatred toward it, only respect. He had survived because he refused to stop fighting, even when the situation seemed hopeless. And though his body would take time to recover, his story would remain, a reminder that even in the most desperate moments, the human spirit can endure. Lucas walked forward, carried not by strength, but by the simple truth that he had lived through what many wouldn't dare imagine.